I guess we only read like the first story in this one, but the next one is titled Dead End. When the trucker pulled up to the toll booth on Route 895 in Virginia, it was in the middle of the night, and the look on his face was one of confusion and fear. The toll booth attendant listened to the man's story and then sent him on his way. I need to sit up. Hold on. Okay. The state highway is referred to as the Pocahontas Parkway, so maybe the man's story was just a play on the name's motif. But when the highway department received more than a few phone calls that night from distressed motorists, each telling essentially the same story, the authorities began to take notice. What the truckers saw, what all of them claimed to have seen, was a small group of Native Americans standing on the median between the eastbound and westbound lanes of traffic near the Mill Road. The trucker described them as standing motionless in the grass, each holding a burning torch. He assumed they were picketing, of course. After all, the parkway is rumored to cut through the land sacred. The parkway is rumored to cut through land that's sacred to the local Native American tribes. But the middle of the night didn't seem like the right time for a peaceful protest. So it didn't sit well with him, or for the others who claimed to see the very same thing. I should change, actually. We're not playing League anymore. So swap it over to just chatting. How do I? Oh, I knew I spelled his last name wrong. Hi, Taltito. Okay, updated the stream. The Times Dispatch caught wind of the story, and soon people were flocking to the Mill Street overpass to see if they, too, could catch a glimpse of the ghosts. And that's what it all comes down to, isn't it? We all want to see the ghosts. Thank you for the follow, Luke. To witness history press its face against the glass of the present, to cheat reality in a sense. Each year, thousands of people around the world claim that they have seen a ghost. They tell their stories and pass along their goosebumps like some communicable disease. But the reality is that most of us never see a thing. History is often nothing more than a distant memory. In some places, though, that history floats a bit closer to the surface. A seat of conflict. When the English arrived in what is now Virginia way back in 1607, they found the land heavily populated by the original inhabitants of the region. The English called them the Powhatan, although that was just the name of their leader. If you don't recognize his name, that's understandable, but everyone certainly remembers his daughter, Pocahontas. Before Richmond was Richmond, the land where it is now stands. Oh my gosh. The land where it now stands was an important Powhatan settlement. In 1607, a party from Jamestown traveled inland and claimed the location as their own. Possessions of the land bounced back and forth between the Native Americans and the English for years, but in 1737 the tribe finally lost and Richmond was born. Early on, Richmond played a host to important figures in the American Revolution. Patrick Henry, the man who shouted, "Give me liberty or give me death," did so from St. John's Church right there in the town. And in the middle of the Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson served as the governor of Virginia out of Richmond. Less than a century later, Richmond became a key city in the Confederacy as the Civil War tore the country apart. From its munitions factory and railroad system to the seat of the new government under Jefferson Davis, the city was powerful. And right at the center of it all is Belle Isle. It sits right there in the James River between Hollywood Cemetery to the north and Forest Hill to the south. It's easy to overlook on the map, but far from being an afterthought. Belle Isle is actually home to some of the most painful memories in the history of the city. Before the English arrived and Captain John Smith stood atop the rocks there, it belonged to the Powhatan. Shortly after the English took control of it in the early 1700s, it was a fishery, and then, in 1814, the Old Dominion Iron and Nail Company built a factory there. Positioned on the river, where the strong current never tired, it was in the perfect location to harness the power of the water. As the ironworks grew, so did its footprint. The factory expanded. A village was built around it, and a general store even popped up to serve the hundreds of people who called this island home. But they wouldn't be the only ones to live there. In 1862, Confederate forces moved onto the island and began to fortify it. Their plan was to use the isolated island as a prison camp, and they began to transport Union captives there by the thousands. Over the 3 years it was in operation, the prison played host to more than 30,000 Union soldiers, sometimes more than 10,000 at a time. And the crowded space and resentful feelings between the Confederate and Union sides led to deplorable actions and conditions. In 1882, after living with memories of the prison camp for nearly 2 decades, New York cavalry officer William H. Wood wrote to the editor of the National Tribune with his observations. Many froze to death during the winter. Others were tortured in the most barbarous manner. I have seen men put astride a wooden horse such as masons use, say 5 feet high, with their feet tied to stakes in the ground, and there left for an hour or more on a cold winter morning. Often their feet would freeze and burst open. He also wrote of their lack of food. A lieutenant's dog was once enticed over the bank and taken into an old tent where it was killed and eaten raw. Your humble servant had a piece of it. For this act of a hungry men, the entire camp was kept out of rations all day. Oh my God, donkey. There were only a few wooden shacks to house the prisoners, so they lived out their days completely exposed to the elements. Blistering heat, freezing cold, rain, and frost, all of it contributed to the suffering of the men who were held there. Estimates vary depending on the source, but it's thought that nearly half of those who were brought there, that's close to 15,000, never left alive. Today, Belle Isle is a public park haunted by a dark past, and by those who lived and died there long ago. You can't see their ghosts, but you can certainly feel them. It's a heavy place. Visitors to the island claim to have felt its dark past in the air, like the stifling heat of an iron forge. But there are other places in Richmond that are said to be haunted as well. Unlike Belle Isle, these locations aren't in ruins or nearly forgotten by the living. They're right in the middle of everyday life, and each one has a unique story to tell. They have their own past, and according to those who have been there, it can still be seen. Memories lost. Technically, Wrexham Hall is in Chesterfield County, just south of Richmond. But when you speak to people about the city's deeply haunting past, it's always brought up as a perfect example of local lore. And while it doesn't have a large number of stories to tell, what it does offer is chilling enough. The house was built at the end of the 18th century by Archibald Walthall, who left the home to his 2 daughters, Polly and Susanna. It was Susanna who later sold her childhood home, but she stipulated that the new owners must always preserve the family graveyard. Time and the elements, though, have allowed the site of the burial ground to slip from memory, and according to some, that's why Susanna has returned to Wrexham Hall, perhaps in an effort to make sure that some piece of the past is remembered. It was years after her death when the home was owned by a man named Stanley Haig. He and a handful of other men had been working in the field near the house when they looked up to see a woman in a red dress sitting on the front porch. They all saw her, and even commented to each other about it. It was hard to miss that bright red against the white house. Later, when Stanley headed home, he asked his wife if her mother had been on the porch that day. No, she told him. She'd been away all day in Richmond. In Hollywood Cemetery, just north of Belle Isle, there are other stories afoot. The graveyard was established in 1849, and it is the final resting place of a number of important figures. Former U.S. Presidents James Moore and John Tyler are buried there, along with Confederate President Jefferson Davis. There are also 2 Supreme Court justices buried there, along with 22 Confederate generals and more than 18,000 soldiers. The soldiers are honored with an enormous stone pyramid that reaches up beyond the trees, and even though no one is buried beneath it, there have been several reports of moans heard coming from the stones. Others have claimed to have felt cold spots near the base, but it's really a nearby grave that's the site of most activity there. The grave belongs to a little girl who died at the age of 3 from childhood illness, and standing beside her tombstone is a large cast-iron dog. According to the local legend, the dog once stood outside her father's grocery store, but when she passed away in 1862, it was moved to her grave to look after her. That might not be completely accurate, though. In the early 1860s, many iron objects were melted down and used for military purposes, and so the dog was most likely moved to the cemetery as a way of protecting it. That hasn't stopped the stories, though. Stories that include visions of a little girl playing near the grave, or the sounds of barking in the middle of the night. Nearby on Carey Street is the historic Bird Theater. It was built in 1928 and named after the founder of Richmond himself, William Byrd. The space inside is enormous. It can seat over 900 on the lower level and another 400 or so in the balcony, and it's up there that some of the oddest experiences have taken place. When the theater opened its doors in December 1928, Robert Coulter was the manager, and he continued to serve in that role all the way up to 1971, when he passed away. For over 4 decades, he was a permanent fixture in the theater, often found sitting in his favorite seat up on one side of the balcony, and if we can believe the stories, Robert never left. The current manager has been told by a number of people that they've seen a tall man in a suit sitting in the balcony at times where no one else was up there. Others have physically felt someone pass by them while they were operating the projector. The former manager has even been seen on more than one occasion by employees locking the front doors at night, as if he were coming out to help them. The stories that are whispered about places like the Bird Theater aren't alone. There are dozens of locations across the city that claim unusual activity and equally eerie stories, but none can claim to have played host to a flesh and blood monster. None, that is, except one. In 1875, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway was looking to connect some track in Richmond to another spur 75 miles to the south. Newport News was down that way, and that meant the ocean and shipping. It was a gamble to make the railroads more profitable in the wake of the Industrial Revolution and its increasing demand for things like coal, something mined in western Virginia. Part of the new railway line would cut through Richmond near Jefferson Park, and it was decided that a tunnel would be constructed for the track to pass through. The trains would enter on 18th Street and then exit 4,000 feet away on the eastern end, nearer 31st Street. It was one of those ideas that sounded perfect on paper. Reality, though, had a few complications to throw at them. Richmond sits on a geographical foundation of clay, as opposed to the bedrock found in other parts of the state. It's the kind of soil that changes consistency depending on the season and weather. Rainy months lead to more groundwater, and that swells the clay. Dry months would cause the opposite. As you can imagine, it's difficult to build on a ground that constantly changes its density. During construction, there were a number of cave-ins. Between the project's inception in 1875 and its completion 6 years later, at least 10 men died while working in the tunnel. Even after it was opened, water had a tendency to seep in and cause problems, something that went on for decades. Around 1901, though, alternate routes were created and the Churchill Tunnel was used less and less. But when the railroad wanted to increase capacity in 1925, they remembered the old tunnel and began to work to bring it up to modern standards. Maybe now, they thought, they could do it right. By autumn of 1925, the tunnel was playing host to a crew of brave men. Supported by a work train powered by steam, they were slowly making their way along the lengths of tunnel, making repairs, improving the engineering, and hopefully making the tunnel safe for future use. But even after claiming so many lives decades before, the tunnel didn't seem done just yet. On October 2nd, while doing what they had been doing for weeks, dozens of men were working inside the tunnel when the ceiling collapsed. Most escaped, but 5 men were trapped inside, buried alive. And to make matters worse, the steam engine exploded when the weight of the debris pressed down on it, filling the tunnel with steam and dust and contributing to even further collapse. It is a death trap, you're so right. According to the story, as it's told today, something did in fact walk out of the tunnel, but it wasn't human. They say it was a hulking creature, covered in strips of decaying flesh with sharp teeth and a crazed look in its eyes. And because witnesses reported that blood was flowing from its mouth, many have since referred to it as the Richmond Vampire. No one could explain why the creature was there. Some suggested that it had been attracted to the carnage and had come to feed. They say that's why the early rescue attempts only found one of the 5 missing men, still seated at the controls of the work train. There was no sign of the other victims of the tragedy, though, so some suggested that perhaps the vampire had something to do with that. Witnesses say that the creature fled out of the eastern end of the tunnel, past the gathering crowd of workers, and then made its way south to Hollywood Cemetery. Some of the workmen who had managed to escape the collapse and witness the creature's getaway were able to give chase, following it through the graveyard for a distance. And then, they claimed, it slipped into one of the tombs, the final resting place of a man named W. Poole. Poole, it turns out, was a relatively unknown accountant who had died just 3 years before. According to the local legend, this made sense. The blood on the mouth, the jagged teeth, the return to the mausoleum, all of it pointed to one undeniable fact, and the story quickly spread across the city, becoming one of the premier legends of Richmond. It's Warwick. Warwick's origin story, just in real life. Poole was a vampire, of course. It said that people turned to the cemetery for many nights, eagerly waiting to see if the vampire would emerge from its hiding place once more. But there are no other stories that tell us what happened next. If the Richmond vampire had been active before the Churchill Tunnel incident, it seems he went into retirement immediately after. Like many tales of local lore, this story ends with an unsatisfying note. Just as the mysterious creature's trail from the collapsed tunnel finally ended in the shadowy doorway of a cold mausoleum, the story of what happened seems to end in shadows of its own. Much like the tunnel itself, it was now nothing more than a dead end. A funny thing happened somewhere between real-life events in the past and the stories we tell each other around the campfire dinner room table. Much like the tried-and-true telephone game, where the message is passed from person to person through a long chain of possession, these old stories shift and change. The change is never visible. The tales adapt to a new culture or take on elements that are only relevant to a particular generation. But after decades, sometimes even centuries, these stories stand before us transformed, which is the difference between history and folklore, after all. With history, there's a paper trail, a clear image of the original that time and distance have more difficulty corroding. Sorry, that statement was strange to me. Hi, Mama. Folklore is like water, forever shifting to fit the crevice as the rock breaks down. Richmond is an old city by the standards of most Americans. Yes, there are older places on the East Coast, but Richmond has a storied history that makes it feel almost timeless. Jamestown, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Confederacy. American history would be lacking something essential without the role of Richmond and the role it has played throughout it all. Some of that history is unchanged, but some, it seems, has undergone deep transformation over the years. And the prime example of that is the story of the Richmond vampire. The collapsed tunnel and the train inside it are all fact. There's even been modern-day efforts to recover the train and clear the rubble, but the tunnel is now flooded with the same groundwater that made it unstable in the first place. The events of that dark October day in 1925 were real, though at least to a degree. A lone survivor did crawl from the wreckage, as the story tells us. His teeth were sharp and his mouth was bloody. Even the condition of his skin, hanging from his body like wet linen bandages, is documented fact. But the survivor had a name: Benjamin Mosby. He was a 28-year-old employee of the railroad and was described as big and strong. At the moment of the accident, he had been standing in front of the train's open coal door, shirt off, covered in sweat, and shoveling fuel into the fire. When the tunnel collapsed, the boiler burst under the pressure, washing Mosby in a flood of scalding water. He somehow survived, crawled free from the rock and twisted metal, and walked to safety. He died the following day at the local hospital, and it was his appearance, with bloody, broken teeth and skin boiled from his body in ribbons, that fueled the story we still whisper today. It's almost cliche to say it, but it's true. Sometimes real-life events that birth a legend turn out to be more frightening and horrific than any folklore could ever be. Everything floats. Some tragedy takes no effort at all to happen. One moment life is perfect and normal and everything is expected to be... Oh my goodness. One moment life is perfect and normal and everything we expect it to be. Then it changes in an instant. No warning, no chance to avoid it. It just happens. Natural disaster is one of those agents of tragedy that seem to sneak up on us and bring ruin into our lives. Fire, flood, tropical storms. Just watching the news each night can give us a glimpse into yet one more episode of pain and suffering that no one saw coming. Other tragedies, though, exist only because we have ushered them into our world. Sometimes that we has been humanity as a collective, and sometimes it's just one broken individual. Genocide or patricide, school shootings or terrorism. Regardless of the source, these are tragedies that couldn't have existed without human involvement. It doesn't make them any less painful, mind you. Sometimes it even makes them worse. These moments of tragedy, thankfully, are very spread out. We have a chance to breathe and move on, but give a city enough time and those tragedies can start to pile up. The older the place, the deeper the pain. A murder here, a disaster there, throw in a war or two for good measure. Soon its entire history can feel like one long nightmare. Nowhere is that more true than in the city that most would call the Big Easy. Underneath its eclectic architectural mix of Old Creole, French, Spanish, Victorian, and even Greek revival, amidst the parties and lights and music that all seem to pulse through the streets like blood, there's something darker. Because there's one thing that's hard for anyone to deny. If it was tragic, painful, or eerie, it probably happened in New Orleans. It's safe to say that New Orleans is one of those cities that just about everyone has an impression of, whether correct or incorrect. It's a cultural icon and a showcase of just how textured and diverse American history truly is. We can blame much of that on the age of the city. The city, which celebrated its tricentennial in 2018, was founded by the French Mississippi Company in 1718. Other than the early settlements of New England, many of whom claimed incorporation in the early to mid 1600s. Sorry, that statement was also strange. There are a few places in the United States that are as old as New Orleans, and that age has brought the city more than its fair share of pain and tragedy. Give me just a sec. I'm going to take a water break real quick because I'm starting to read ahead with my eyes when I mean to not do that. Wait, is Peppy here? He's the one that said that he wants me to read, and he's not here. Anywho. It was land that had once been occupied by the... Oh, fuck, toe beans is I'm here, but yes, you do count. I adore you, and I'm glad you're here. I just know that Peppy called me, not necessarily called me a liar, but he said I'd be fibbing. Rude. Okay, it was land that had once been occupied by the local Chitimacha tribe of the Native Americans, and the Europeans, of course, took it from them. From the outset, it has been seen by everyone as valuable territory. Sitting at the mouth of the mighty Mississippi River, it acted like a doorway into the heart of the continent, and for nearly 50 years, the French controlled the gate. I'm not saying I didn't, but fair. When the French and Indian War came to a close in 1763, a treaty was signed between Great Britain, France, and Spain. One outcome of that document was that New Orleans fell under the control of Spain, which held on to the city until the French reclaimed it in 1800. 3 years later, Napoleon sold it to the United States as part of the Louisiana Purchase. The War of 1812 brought the first major dose of tragedy to New Orleans. In late summer of 1814, the British attacked Washington, D.C. and burned the White House, the Capitol, and much of the rest of the city. Then they turned their eyes to New Orleans, that doorway to the heart of America. It was Andrew Jackson, future President of the United States, who was charged with defending the city as over 11,000 British troops marched towards it. And he found help in one of the most unlikely places. Two brothers, known across the city as pirate outlaws. Jean and Pierre Lafitte were smugglers who operated out of their blacksmith shop in New Orleans. In Star Wars terms, Jean was the Han Solo of the pair, the daring sailor and smuggler of illegal goods. Pierre, in contrast, was Lando Calrissian, managing the business and acting as the public face of the operation. But after American naval vessels captured their offshore hideout in the fall of 1814, the Lafitte brothers found themselves in legal hot water. The British done did burn our White House. Ghosts aren't unique to... Oh wait, I skipped a whole last paragraph. They found salvation, though, in a deal with Andrew Jackson. In return for gathering troops and supplies for the approaching battle, things like sorely needed gunpowder and flint, Jackson promised to pardon the brothers and turn them into heroes. The brothers delivered the supplies, the Americans won the battle, and Jackson made good on his word, although he had to become president to do so. Wait, am I the only one that noticed Lando Calrissian mentioned? Should I reread that part of the statement of the book? Let's go back a whole paragraph. Jean and Pierre Lafitte were smugglers who operated out of their blacksmith shop in New Orleans. In Star Wars terms, Jean was the Han Solo of the pair, the daring sailor and smuggler of illegal goods. Pierre, in contrast, was Lando Calrissian, managing the business and acting as the public face of the operation. But after the American naval vessels captured their offshore hideout in the fall of 1814, the Lafitte brothers found themselves in legal hot water. Oh, I'm just dyslexic. Truer words have never been stated. For me, at least. Okay, today, Lafitte's blacksmith shop is a bar on Bourbon Street, and one of the oldest buildings in the French Quarter. And with a past as daring and dangerous as the Lafitte's, it's no wonder that stories of ghosts still echo through the establishment. The most common sightings speak of a figure who sits at the bar near the fireplace, dressed in the attire of a late 18th century sailor. Ghosts aren't unique to old bars, though. Just outside the borders of the French Quarter sits the historic St. Louis Cemetery, No. 1. Founded in 1789, it's the oldest and most iconic cemetery in the city. In some ways, it has an appearance and atmosphere similar to Highgate Cemetery in London. It's a maze of small above-ground vaults, many playing host to entire families. It's crowded and old and feels more than a bit creepy. But it's not what's inside the tombs that gets talked about the most. Visitors to the cemetery have frequently encountered mysterious figures, ghosts who apparently haunt the narrow spaces between the tombs. One common sighting is a man known as Henry Vignier. He's said to have been a young sailor who was scammed out of his family tomb by a dishonest landlady. When he died, his body was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave, and because of that, he still wanders the cemetery today, searching. Multiple visitors have claimed to see him approach, and after he asks where the Vignier's tomb is, he's said to turn around and vanish from sight. Another frequent sighting is the ghost of a young man known only as Alphonse. Witnesses claim that they've seen him floating towards them and asking for help finding his home. Others say they've seen him gathering flowers from random graves before walking off with them. Maybe he's lonely, or perhaps he's just looking for a little bit of beauty in such a somber place. Hi, Jones! No one really knows. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 plays host to dozens of well-known figures from the early days of New Orleans, but the most famous resident, according to most, is someone that very few graveyards in the country can lay claim to: a real voodoo queen. When the Atlantic slave trade brought millions of people from Africa against their will and deposited them all over the New World, these people, Africans from dozens of distinct tribal groups, cultures, and languages, were forced to find a common ground. At home, they might have been rivals or even enemies. In captivity, though, unity meant survival. Today we call it the African diaspora, the dispersal of the continent's cultures and peoples and beliefs throughout the world. And everywhere the seeds landed, they sprouted into something slightly different. What was known as Vodou in Africa became Voodoo, Hoodoo, Vodun, and more, and each had its own character and uniqueness. Voodoo is considered to be a religion, with its own core beliefs and leaders. The voodoo of Louisiana has a distinct flavor thanks to what's called syncretism, the blending of its practices and beliefs with those of the Catholic Church. Much of the church has priests. Voodoo honors practitioners called kings and queens. Thank you, Jones and Donkey. Hoodoo, you do. Indeed. A voodoo queen was someone who conducted ceremonies and ritual dances, sometimes before crowds in thousands. To earn a living, these queens would make talismans for others to purchase and use, things like gree bags, which were filled with all sorts of ingredients, then blessed with intention and meaning. These bags function similarly to crosses and are even worn around the neck. One voodoo queen who is still mentioned throughout New Orleans is Julie White. She practiced in the late 1800s, and legend says that her cabin was near the edge of Manchac Swamp. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Sorry if anybody lives in New Orleans or in Louisiana. She was more reclusive than most voodoo queens, but visitors still came for her blessings and predictions. What she preferred to dole out, though, weren't kind words. Julie, they say, was cranky and threatened everyone. Her favorite thing to do was predict the destruction of local communities. In the Mississippi Delta, you never have to wait long for a flood or a storm, and Julie seemed to have an uncanny knack for prophesizing some of them. If ever there was a shining example of a warm, inviting person, Julie was probably not it. The most famous voodoo queen, though, hands down, lived a century before Julie White, and her name was Marie Laveau. She was born in the French Quarter sometime between 1795 and 1805 to Charles Laveau, the fifth mayor of New Orleans. She married in 1819, but her husband died just a year later, and with that, Marie was forced to find new ways to support herself. Local legend says that she worked for a time as a hairdresser, and there's some documentation that points to work as a liquor importer. But sometime after that, Marie set in motion a legendary career as the practitioner of voodoo. Let's put this in perspective. In 1874, she held a St. John's Eve gathering on the shore of Lake Pontchartrain, I think. Estimates place the total number of people in attendance at around 12,000. Maybe it was the power of voodoo at the time, or Marie's electric personality. It was probably a mixture of both, and people loved her for it. Did I skip a page somehow? Nope, I did not. She followed the same pattern as most voodoo queens. She held rites and ceremonies and crafted gree bags for sale. Legend says that Marie learned the practice from an earlier voodoo king, Dr. John, and quickly became his cultural successor. She had the unique privilege of being able to host voodoo rites inside the largest Catholic church in New Orleans, St. Louis Church, thanks to her friendship with the church's rector, known locally as Père Antoine. Most people have forgotten that friendship was built on a very noble pursuit. Marie and Antoine worked together for years to free slaves in the New Orleans area. Marie was also said to be quite well and connected. Countless public figures came to her for her advice, and it was rumored that she also employed a network of spies throughout the city. All of those connections earned her influence and power, things she wasn't afraid to use. One story in particular about Marie Laveau stands out. According to local legend, the son of a wealthy businessman was arrested and charged with murder in the mid-1830s. The father, aware of the reputation of Marie had for getting what she wanted, offered her a deal. If she could free his son, he would purchase her a house of her own. Marie accepted the offer. It said that she spent the weeks before the trial praying incessantly at St. Louis's church. And all the while, Marie held 3 hot guinea peppers in her mouth. When the morning of the trial came, she used her influence to gain access to the courtroom and placed the peppers beneath the judge's chair. Filled with her prayers, they were talismans, designed to influence his mind. In the end, the wealthy man's son was acquitted of all charges, and Millie received her reward. Whether it was her voodoo powers that made it possible or simply her political clout and connections, we'll never really know. But in New Orleans, voodoo always gets the vote. Voodoo isn't the only cultural transplant in New Orleans, though. In a melting pot that includes Creole, Spanish, French, and Native American influences, it probably won't come as any surprise to hear that there are even Turkish stories whispered in the city. What's surprising, however, is just how bloody they are. The house that stands at the corner of Dauphine Street and Orléans Avenue was built by Jean-Baptiste Lebret in 1836. Lebret was a plantain owner who wanted a city home, so he built the Greek Revival mansion as a retreat and as a symbol of his wealth. But that wealth experienced hard times in the wake of the Civil War. Financial troubles forced Lebret to move out of the mansion and find someone to rent it from him. I'm sure he expected another wealthy business owner or a government official. Imagine his shock then when it was a Turkish prince who arrived at the door. The man told Lebret that he was Prince Suleiman, former sultan of an undisclosed country in the Middle East. Cash was exchanged, Lebret turned over the keys, and the sultan and his household moved in. According to the story, the household fit the stereotype one might expect from a film adaptation of the Arabian tale 1001 Nights. The sultan had many wives, a large extended family, and a whole team of servants. He brought with him furniture and decorations, enormous rugs and tapestries, paintings, and other symbols of his wealth and power. After the sultan settled into the mansion, a pair of Turkish soldiers were assigned to stand guard outside the door, armed with scimitars. I know, Sachi. But the guards weren't able to keep the rumors from spreading, and the stories grew more and more elaborate. It was said that the house would be quiet during the day, but after darkness fell, it would come alive. The mansion, locals said, had become a pleasure palace. Nights were filled with orgies and extravagant parties. Some whispered that young women, and even boys and girls, had gone missing in the neighborhood, and the blame was placed on the sultan's appetite for carnal pleasures. There was no proof, of course, but the neighbors loved to talk. Oh my goodness, Sachi, you're the one that came onto my lap. Why are you so mad at me? You're fine. Go into your bed. Stop being mad at me. I didn't do it. There's no proof, of course, but neighbors love to talk. Neighbors always love to talk, and they always will, I suppose. Mow! Yeah, she got mad because I was breathing. Story of my life, honestly. Those who walked past the mansion would often comment on the smell of incense that drifted out of the windows. But that's not all the locals noticed. One morning, a neighbor was out for a walk, and as he passed by the sultan's mansion, he noticed something dark on the front steps. He stopped and took a second look, and then slowly backed away in horror. How dare you breathe my air? Exactly. Blood was everywhere. It covered the top step and had run in small rivers down the dark stairs, and all of it seemed to have come from the narrow space between the door. The neighbor quickly went to the police, and they arrived a short time later. After attempts to unlock the front door failed, they forced their way in. What they found inside, though, was far worse than they'd imagined. Bodies laid all over the main hall. Some of them were complete, but most were torn apart. The floor was covered in blood, and it was easy to see how it could have managed to run all the way to the doorway and then down the stairs. Everywhere they looked, they saw death and gore. According to the story, the police continued into the house and soon came upon the courtyard garden near the rear of the mansion. At first, everything seemed normal there, but then one of the officers pointed to a spot on the ground. There, protruding from the wet soil, was a human hand. It's said that the Sultan himself was spared the dismemberment that the rest of his household experienced. Instead, the killer had buried the prince alive in the garden after wrapping the man in 3 white sheets and binding him with rope. He had somehow managed to get one hand free before suffocating to death. To this day, no one knows who the killer was, but there are theories. One suggestion was, oddly enough, pirates. It's not likely, and not a popular theory, but it suggests that perhaps the wealth and possessions inside the house were not really the Sultan's after all. Still, I have a hard time imagining pirates doing whatever it is they do on land in the middle of a large city. The more popular theory is that the Sultan was actually on the run from his homeland. People whispered that he wasn't really a prince, but the brother of one, and that he had somehow stolen a portion of his brother's wealth and came to America. As a result, the false Sultan was hunted down and his entire household was killed for his crimes. Today, after decades of neglect, the mansion has been converted into a luxury apartment. Tenants claim to have heard mysterious footsteps and the sounds of parties. Some have even heard the faint echo of unusual music, something they say has a Middle Eastern flavor. Others, though, have seen things. Some have witnessed groups of ghostly people passing from room to room, or body parts that vanish a moment later. Most significant, though, is the lone figure of a man who's been seen floating through the halls before mysteriously disappearing through locked doors. Perhaps, even after all these years, the Sultan is still looking for a way out. New Orleans is a big city with a deep past, and I fully admit that its history and lore are larger than the picture I've painted here. And maybe that's the power of it, the uniqueness of it, you know? There are very few places in America that can claim as much tragedy over so many centuries, and that legacy shows. And the attraction of that legacy has never faded. Celebrities and tourists alike still flock to the city. Anne Rice gave it new life through her vampire novels, and in 2010, Nicolas Cage purchased a plot in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. He plans to build a tomb shaped like a small pyramid because, well, why the heck not, right? I think we would be missing the point to think of New Orleans as simply a place where the Mardi Gras happens every year, or as just a center for jazz and Cajun cuisine. It's bigger than that, deeper than that. There's a darkness, you see, that floats just beneath the surface, and we've been mistaken to ignore it, and some say that darkness still holds power. Remember Julie White, the voodoo queen who lived on the edge of Manchac Swamp? Like Marie Laveau, she was sought after by many in the community for her advice and oracle-like predictions, and because of that, she had quite a following. Still, her final prediction left people feeling unsettled. "One day, I'm gonna die," she said, "and I'm gonna take all of you with me." Julie did die, and of course, in late September 1915. Oops, I'm sorry. I think I read Pandora a little bit too early in my childhood. Anywho, Julie did die, of course, in late September of 1915. She was feared, yes, but she was also deeply loved, and so the locals gathered in large number to throw her the funeral they felt she deserved. And on the day of that gathering, September 21st, a Category 4 hurricane made landfall, ripping through New Orleans and the surrounding area. The Sleeping Beauty trilogy, or the Claiming of Sleeping Beauty, no one told me what it was about, and they dared me to read the first book. And because I'm a pain in the butt, I took the dare, and I was so upset. I was so mad that I was reading smut. I thought it was just like a darker retelling of Sleeping Beauty, but no. Like, the first 3 pages in, I'm like, oh my god, what did I get myself into? Anywho, out of nowhere, 130-mile-per-hour winds and 15-foot waves ravaged the Delta region. Everyone at the funeral died, nearly 200 of them, they say, and locals from the towns of Frenia were left with the grim task of gathering their bodies and burying them in a mass grave in the swamp. Even today, more than a century later, locals say that the bodies will occasionally float to the surface of the water. Perhaps it's just a natural process for a swamp that's filled with hundreds of corpses. Or maybe Julie White, the Oracle of Manchac Swamp, just wants us to never forget that she was right. Anywho, She read all of it. I only read the first one. I never read the other two. But I did find a copy, like an advanced reader copy of one of the books, and I own it, but I never read it because I just can't do smut. Like, it's... And, like, it's not hardcore BDSM smut, but it's, like, BDSM smut. Back to folklore. Downriver. They named the village after the Latin word for serpent. Coluber. Coluber? It was a lot. Today, though, so many centuries later, its name is rarely spoken by those who live in the... Oh my goodness. Basilicata region of Italy? There's something about it that gives local Italians the feeling of dread, and they'd rather not speak its name. Colobraro earned that reputation, though, if we're to believe the stories. It's said that in the early years of the 20th century, the town was home to a very successful but very disliked lawyer named Biagio Virgilio. Virgilio was speaking in court one day, according to the story, when he pointed up towards the ceiling of the courthouse. "If what I say is false," he shouted, "may this chandelier come down." And it did. It dropped right into the middle of the room and shattered into 1,000 pieces. And while no one was injured, the town's reputation took a dark hue. It was cursed, they said, hexed, and later events only served to reinforce that belief. Landslides, car accidents, there were even stories of babies born with 2 hearts or 3 lungs. And, of course, tales of witchcraft. Locations take on a flavor over time, whether it's our hometown or just an infamous spot in the area. We have a tendency to treat locations like people. They have a personality and a reputation, and some, if you listen to the locals, are even cursed. When life doesn't go the way we'd hoped, we look for reasons. Claiming that our town is cursed is an easy way to make sense of the accidental, the unexpected, and the unfortunate, but sometimes the evidence is dark and deep, and it includes suffering, death, and even utter destruction. There's this notion that's almost as old as time itself, that a city or nation that strays too far from its roots, or from its moral center, puts itself at risk of being cursed. Hebrew legend speaks of the Tower of Babel, which shows how the pride of one settlement brought about destruction and confusion. The ancient stories of Atlantis spoke of the island civilization as technologically and socially advanced, but it was their greed and immortality that led the gods to destroy them. According to the interpretation of the ancient writers, they were cursed by their behavior. Other ancient stories speak of a city that once stood in the southern sands of the Arabian Peninsula. It's mentioned in the Quran, the Christian Bible, and even Arabian Nights in the Arabian Nights tales. It was known as Ubar, Iram, Wabar, or the city of Ad. And after serving as a trade center for over 5 millennia, it vanished roughly 2,000 years ago. Satellite scans in the 1980s finally provided us with an answer. The city, it turns out, was built on an enormous subterranean cavern, and sometime in 8300, it all collapsed. There are so many other examples. Port Royal in the Caribbean, the ancient Greek city of Helike, even Pompeii comes to mind. But these stories aren't limited to dusty cities spoken of in ancient texts. Even here in the United States, in a country that's relatively young compared to much of the world, we can find stories of cursed locations and horrible tragedy. On November 1st, 1886, tragedy came to Lafayette, Oregon. That was the day that David Corker, a 57-year-old shopkeeper, was found dead in his general store by a customer. The shop had been broken into overnight, and Corker had been killed while defending his store. The suspect was a man named Richard Marple. He'd moved there with his wife, Julia, and mother, Anna, just a year before, and the rumor was that he'd chosen a life of crime over gainful employment. The man, they say, was a thief. Add that to a handful of eyewitness reports of how Marple openly mocked the shopkeeper, and it's hard to ignore him as a suspect. The sheriff visited his home and found a bloody shirt, a scrap of paper in his pocket with bloodstains on it, and a collection of tools used for breaking into locked buildings. Marple was convicted of murder on April 9th of 1887. His wife and mother fought the charges. They provided a solid alibi, swearing as to his whereabouts that night. It didn't work, though. Marple was hanged on November 11th, just a little over a year after Corker had been found dead. 30 locals gathered to watch as the man strangled to death at the end of a rope for nearly 18 minutes. Marple's mother wasn't allowed to watch the execution, but she could hear the screaming from a distance. She cursed the town, they say, and predicted that 3 fires would burn Lafayette to the ground. It was easy to laugh it off, though. Predictions like that always are. So, that's what the inhabitants did. No one was suspicious when a blaze ripped through the town in 1895. Towns, especially those built mostly out of wood, have a knack for catching fire. Whoop! Thank you for the gift sub. I super appreciate it. And it went to Dower. Hell yeah. Congratulations, Dower. Oops. I lost my train of thought. I lost my place. No one was suspicious when a blaze... Okay, yep. 6 buildings were leveled by the flames. 2 years later, another fire broke out, destroying 4 more. And then, in 1904, a fire destroyed 16 buildings as it raged across the town. A random series of accidents, or the product of a curse by a very angry mother. For some, that isn't an easy question to answer. Another location that's haunted by tales of a curse is the Dutch village of oh my goodness. Wait! I don't know if I can pronounce this name. Saftinge? Maybe? Well, it was, up until the late 1500s, that is. Let me explain what I mean. In the Middle Ages, Saftinge was a hub for the harvesting of peat. The village was situated in what is known as the polders, the floodplains that were separated from the ocean by man-made dikes and dams. And because peat was a popular source of fuel at the time, Safingde was an important community in the region. Peat was in such high demand that, according to some historians, the farmers of Safingde, that is such a hard word to say, were said to dress in fine silks. They even decorated their draft horses with gold and silver jewelry. Of course, this led to a reputation for greed and selfishness, which wasn't helped by the fact that the townsfolk would chase newcomers away with weapons and dogs. Basically, they weren't friendly people, and no one likes a jerk, right? As the story goes, a farmer was fishing outside Safingde one day when he reeled in a real-life mermaid. Apparently, she could speak Dutch, and she warned the farmer that unless the town straightened up and stopped being greedy, something horrible was going to happen. The farmer laughed at her and decided that a pet mermaid would be nice to have, so he tied her up. Even when the mermaid's husband surfaced and begged for her release, the farmer refused. So, the merman uttered a curse. "The lands of Safingde will fall," he said. "Only its towers will continue to stand tall." In 1570, a flood swept over the Dutch coast, inundating the land around the town. 14 years later, in 1584, the Dutch army was fighting the 80 Years' War and destroyed one of the dikes that held back the ocean. The town of Safingde was overcome by an enormous wave and never seen again. Today, the region is known as Verdronken Land, drowned land, but locals say that not all of Safingde is gone. Somewhere beneath the marsh and water, if the stories are to be believed, the old church tower still stands tall. And on foggy days, they say, you can still hear the bell toll. In the southwestern corner of Illinois is a city on the edge of the Mississippi. Now, it's easy to limit the history of a place to our American experience, but Illinois is older than that. In fact, the entire area from the Arkansas River up to Green Bay was once controlled by the French. They explored the region in 1673 and then claimed it for the French crown shortly after. They called it Upper Louisiana and sometimes Illinois country. Most of the settlers who moved into the area were French Canadians from the north, and the biggest draw for them across this whole stretch of new territory was fur trapping. The upper Mississippi Valley was apparently a gold mine for trappers and hunters, and so they moved south to chase their fortunes. They built 6 major settlements along the eastern edge of modern-day Illinois. One of those was established near a tribe of Native Americans who took their name from a small tributary that joined the larger Mississippi. There were a lot of variants. White Europeans were rarely ever good at taking a Native American name and carrying it over to French or English in a consistent way, but everyone there began to call the place Kaskaskia. Before we move on, though, let me briefly explain the geography of this area. You see, Kaskaskia was a settlement built right on the tip of a small peninsula that stuck out into the Mississippi River. To the east, you could walk deeper into the Illinois Territory. Looking west from the town would give you a spectacular view of the Great River. That was the territory known as the state of Missouri. Kaskaskia, in a lot of ways, was a place caught in between. And not just geographically. On a social level, the settlement was a mixture of French-Canadian fur trappers, Jesuit missionaries, and local Native Americans. The Jesuits brought the structure, the trappers brought the economy, and the indigenous people brought, well, they'd already been there. And, as with so many stories about the early days of this country, that meant the Native Americans weren't going to get a fair shake. One story clearly highlights this disparity. In 1698, about 25 years after the settlement was founded, a Frenchman named Jean Bernard immigrated to Kaskaskia, along with his wife and daughter, Marie. Like a lot of people who moved there, Bernard was a fur trader, and the abundant resources of the area promised to make him a wealthy man. He set up his trading post on the edge of town, where it would be easily accessible to the trappers moving up and down the western edge of Illinois. They brought in the fur, he purchased it from them, and then he sold it to buyers outside of the wild frontier. It was simple and lucrative, and before long, he had a thriving business. As the trading post grew, Bernard brought on more help. It was common in those days of Kaskaskia for European business owners to hire local Native Americans to do the manual labor. And that was how one man in particular came to work for the Frenchmen. History doesn't remember his name, but the tale does describe how Jean Bernard mistreated the man. He was cruel and unfair towards him, and always gave the worst labor to him and other Native Americans who worked in the shop. But this man was different from most of the other Kaskaskians in the region. It seems that the Jesuits had worked with his family decades before, and he himself was raised to speak both his native tongue and French, which made him a valuable helper. Bernard took a liking to the young man, and they formed a good working relationship as a result. Water time. But Jean Bernard wasn't the only person to take a liking to the Kaskaskian. Apparently his daughter Marie fell in love with the man, something that her father was strongly opposed to. The legend says that he fired the young Native American and then spread word around the town that he wasn't to be hired by any of the other businesses. His goal was to drive the man to leave the town in search of a job, and apparently it worked. Marie, of course, was heartbroken, but there was nothing she could do. And then, a year later, a group of traders rode into town, and among them was her lost love. He returned to claim her hand and take her away, to end their separation and build a new life together elsewhere. Somehow he managed to pass a message to her, and they arranged to meet in secret later that night. Once together, the couple left town, disappearing up the Great Mississippi. It's never that simple, though. Yes, they had a head start, and yes, they had love on their side. But Marie's father would not be defied so easily. The moment he learned of his daughter's escape, Bernard gathered together a large group of men, and they rode out of town to hunt the couple down. I don't know how they knew to ride north, but that's what they did. Maybe they assumed her lover was looking for work in one of the bigger settlements. Maybe they knew he had friends or family north of Kaskaskia. Whatever their reason was, they followed the Mississippi northward. It would have taken them hours, but eventually they tracked the two lovers down just outside of Cahokia. The town of Cahokia was another ancient Native American settlement that had become the site of a French outpost. Like Kaskaskia, it was home to a mix of French Canadians and Native Americans, and made it a good hiding place for a couple like Marie and her true love. When Bernard's group found them, they immediately separated the couple. Marie was kept safe and watched over, while the man she loved was beaten and bound with rope. They dragged him to the very edge of the river, and then began to search for a large branch or a fallen tree that they could manage. I think I skipped a line. Hold on. They dragged him to the very edge of the river, and then began searching for a large branch or a fallen tree that they could manage. When they found one, they hauled it towards their prisoner. The young man was tied to the log with yet more rope. We know he spoke French, and so did Bernard and his men, so there was probably a lot of conversation. It's likely that he begged for his life, begged for Marie, begged for freedom. But the wrath of the angry father isn't something words can sway. Not for Jean Bernard, at least. So the work continued. When they were satisfied with their knots, the men pushed the log into the dark waters of the river. I imagined them wading out a bit, pushing it along, making sure it made it past all the debris and vegetation growing along the bank there. And then they let go, and watched as the young man drifted downriver with the current. We don't know if Bernard made his daughter watch it at all. We don't know if she was whisked away back to Kaskaskia before she could see it all unfold. But we do know that the man she loved shouted from the river as he drifted away. His words, they say, carried a powerful curse. Bernard would be dead within a year, he claimed, and he and Marie would be reunited forever. And then he added that the town of Kaskaskia itself would suffer. The French there would be destroyed, and even the dead would find no rest in their graves. Later that year, Bernard got caught up in a bad business deal. He accused another man of cheating him and challenged him to a duel. Bernard lost the duel and his life. Later that year, Marie herself died. They say she wasted away from a broken heart, but her death allowed her to reunite with her lover, and nothing would ever keep them apart again. By the 1740s, the British were making moves to take over the territory controlled by the French. They bribed a number of neighboring Native American tribes to join them in a war against the settlers there, and by 1765, the French were run out of town. It seems Marie's true love was right about more than a few things. Kaskaskia did its best to persevere, though. After the American Revolution, it became the capital of the Northwest Territory, and then, in 1818, it became the first capital of the state of Illinois. But that only lasted for about a year. All along, the town kept growing, and by the mid-1800s, it was the home to roughly 7,000 people. And then the Mississippi River got involved. In 1844, a flood nearly wiped the town off the map, and very few of the citizens stayed to rebuild. Instead, they went looking for a safer place to live. The Mississippi has always flooded. It still does, and that's made life difficult for anyone who lives along its banks. After 1844, a lot fewer people in Kaskaskia were willing to take that risk. In the years that followed, the Great River did something extraordinary. It moved. Slowly, it began to change course, shifting to pass by the town on the eastern side rather than to the west. What was once a peninsula was slowly becoming an island. An island instead. And after another major flood in 1881, the shift was complete. Today, Kaskaskia is on the western shore of the Mississippi. Thanks to an act of Congress, it's a little pocket of Illinois on the edge of Missouri. Not that most people would notice, though. By 1950, there were only about 122 people left to call the place their home. I think there are a couple of indisputable facts buried in these stories that we would be wrong to ignore. First, people love to curse their own, or the town of their enemies, or whatever town they had a bad day in. We like to blame others for our own misfortune. or tell stories that explain away our bad luck and tragedy. It can't be our own fault after all, so maybe the town itself is to blame, right? Second, no place is safe from tragedy. At some point, whether it takes decades or centuries, every location is going to experience its own fair share of loss and misfortune. Fires, floods, natural disasters, or human error. No matter what the cause is, every location will eventually receive a visit from adversity. On their own, there are both On their own, these are both sad truths. Together, though, they create a new world. One where cities are cursed and the tragedies they experience are rooted in supernatural causes. Oftentimes, the easiest thing to believe is also the most irrational. Still, some locations do seem to have an unusual amount of tragedy heaped upon them, Kaskaskia being a prime example. And it didn't end in 1950. Even after the flood, the remaining citizens rebuilt the old Jesuit church and tried to move on. That's all they could do, I suppose. Still, they had to wonder. And then, on April 4th, 1973, the Mississippi rose nearly 45 feet above normal levels. The north levees broke, and the river rushed in, threatening much of the town. Hundreds of college students from nearby Southern Illinois University, along with residents of the mainland, and dozens of prison inmates all gathered there to lay sandbags and fight the flood as best they could. But it was no use. The new church and most of the town around it were washed away. And that includes the cemetery. Local legend says that the flood of 1973 caused a number of graves to burst open, washing hundreds of caskets, along with their occupants, into the depths of the river. The dead, just like Marie's lover had predicted, had risen from their graves. That concludes that chapter. Would you guys like me to start the next one, or should we call it a night? We still have about 20 minutes for stream. Let me see if I can find the end of this chapter. Oh, it's only 20 pages. I can do that. Away inside. In 1897, Boston opened the Tremont Street subway. It was a pioneer, setting the stage for the future of underground public transit. I stream on Saturday and Sundays, so it will be on Saturday next week. And as crazy as it might seem, it's still in use today, making it the oldest subway tunnel in North America, and the third oldest in the world. Not too shabby for a dark hole in the ground. It isn't a long tunnel system, but it helped people traveling around Boston Common, the massive public park in the middle of the city. Grab a map sometime, find the Common, and then trace your finger around the southeastern chin of the park where Boylston and Tremont Streets intersect. That's where the tunnel passes through. 2 years before it opened to the public, though, workers were digging furiously beneath that corner when they ran into something unexpected. Skeletons. Hundreds and hundreds of human skeletons, over 900 in fact, and all of them right smack in the middle of their path. Since the 1720s, thousands of people have been buried in what would later become known as the Central Burying Ground. But when Boylston Street was extended past there in 1836, the city engineers ran right over a section of the graves. It's more than ironic, really. The burying ground, or at least part of it, got buried. After the skeletons were discovered in 1895, they were all moved to a mass grave, which is still nearby today. This is what happens in old cities. When people have lived and died in one place for so long, things have a tendency to get buried and lost to time. Bodies for sure, but also the lives those bodies represent. We end up burying our pain, our tragedy, our loss, and all of those hidden memories have a way of popping back up when we least expect it. Boston is one of those cities. I know it's young by European standards, but it's one of the oldest in America. And all that age comes with a rich history, one that's full of conflict and tragedy and pain. Pain, some say, that can still be felt today. The city of Boston probably requires no introduction. It's central to so many of the early ideas and emotions that fueled the birth of America, and it's one of the key stages upon which that conflict was played out. Boston was, and still is, an epicenter for rebellious spirit. Most of us know it as the setting for the Boston Tea Party in 1773, which wasn't really a party, by the way. 3 years before that, there was the Boston Massacre, which was really a massacre. There are well-known events with their own touch of darkness. These are well-known events with their own touch of darkness, but Boston's history is even darker than that. Boston Common, that giant public park in the middle of the city that I mentioned earlier, is a good example. Sure, locals still use it for cattle grazing, locals still used it for cattle grazing all the way up to 1830, but long before that, the Common was a popular place to execute criminals. Although criminals might be a misleading term. They hanged a good number of pirates and thieves, true, but they also killed Quakers for trespassing and suspected witches for heresy. If tragedy leaves a painful shadow on a city, Boston has some dark spots. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 is exactly what it sounds like. A company called Purity Distilling had a massive steel tank that contained 2.3 million gallons of molasses, which they used to make rum. In January of 1919, that tank burst. A wave of syrup 25 feet high rushed through the streets at 35 miles an hour. Buildings were pushed off their foundations. Children were swept away from their parents. At least 21 people were killed. Locals say that on a hot summer day, you can still smell the molasses. Simple chemistry, or the ghosts of a tragic past reasserting themselves. There are other echoes too. Back in the central burying ground above Tremont Street Tunnel, many visitors have seen things they have trouble explaining logically. I was wondering if you were going to get to this story. Do you know of this story? Like the molasses one? I can honestly say that I'm not familiar with it. Like, Julie White, I was 100% familiar with. I knew of her premonition and how a category for hurricane like killed everyone at her funeral. There have been a couple weird mad floods that defy luck there. Hold on. I need to find my place. There are other echoes too. Back in the central burying ground above Tremont Street Tunnel, many visitors have seen things they have trouble explaining logically. The most common sighting is of a little girl who has been seen standing among the gravestones, sometimes walking between them. This ghost, they say, is unique because one key feature, she lacks a face. Just north of the Common is another graveyard known as the Granary Burying Ground. It's one of the oldest cemeteries in town, dating back to 1660, and that means it holds a lot of history and story. The granary is home to a number of well-known individuals, Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and the parents of Benjamin Franklin among them. Of all the Boston massacre victims... My eyes are going ahead of my mouth again. All of the Boston Massacre victims are interred there as well, but the graveyard is home to much more than burials. Some say it's full of restless spirits as well. Ghost hunters love the graveyard for its abundance of orbs, those fuzzy white spots that sometimes appear in photos at night. They also claim to have recorded odd voices and unusual spikes in temperature and electromagnetic fields. If that's your cup of tea, the granary offers a strong brew for sure. Can you imagine how big the container... Right? To have a wave 25 feet tall just like sweep through the city? That container was massive. Ugh. One of the common figures cited in the granary, though, is said to be a man named James Otis. He was a well-known lawyer prior to the American Revolution and is famous for coining the main rallying cry for the rebellion, no taxation without representation. But in 1796, he had an encounter with a British tax collector that ended in violence. During the struggle, the tax official struck Otis in the head with a blunt object, cutting him and, according to some, accelerating the symptoms of a mental illness he had struggled with for years. It's said that years later, Otis was so depressed over his illness that he wrote to his sister and expressed his desire to die quickly. My dear sister, I hope, when God Almighty, in his righteousness providence, shall take me out of time into eternity, that it will be by a flash. On May 23rd, 1783, Otis was standing in the doorway of a friend's house in Andover when he dropped dead. The cause? A bolt of lightning. But not all of Boston's haunted past is limited to the outdoor spaces. Like James Otis, it stands on the doorstep, and if the stories are true, much of it has walked inside. When John Pickering Putnam designed and built the Carlsgate Hotel in 1891, he was at the top of his game. As an architect, he was one of the leading designers of modern apartment buildings. As a builder, he was wildly creative, developing a number of new patents for building elements, including ventilation systems and plumbing. He was just 44 when he finished the Charlesgate. It's a hulking Romanesque revival structure at the corner of Beacon Street and Charlesgate East, and if you drive past, you can't miss it. And although it's been converted to condominiums today, it was originally designed to be a luxury hotel. In between, it's been a boarding house, a college dorm, and home to a few other less savory businesses. But tragedy moved into the hotel early on. In 1908, just 7 years after it was completed, a manufacturing executive named Westwood T. Windrum ended a long struggle with depression and insomnia right there in the hotel. When a loud noise woke Windrum's wife on March 14th, she climbed out of bed only to find her husband dead in the closet, gun still in his hand. 9 years later, architect John Putnam himself died at the age of 70, right in the hotel he designed. And it's all that death and tragedy, some say, that helped give birth to a new type of resident in the building: ghosts. Between 1947 and 1990s, the hotel was converted into a dorm space for Boston University and later on Emerson College. I think I just got an inclement weather notification, sorry. Many of the darker tales come from that era. In one encounter, a student opened his eyes in the middle of the night to see a stranger in his room. That's odd enough on its own, I know, but even more unusual was that this stranger was floating above the student's bed. To make matters worse, the student discovered that he was unable to move. Sleep paralysis, demon, anyone? According to the story, the ghostly floating stranger attacked the student, who screamed in horror. The resident assistant and a handful of other students ran to help, and all of them claimed to see the same ghostly figure for a moment, and then it vanished. Gas leak, anyone? Another student reported waking up to see a black cloud hovering near the ceiling of his dorm room. As he watched it, the dark mist moved across the room and vanished through the wall. There have been tales of unusual Ouija board encounters, unusual dreams, and strange sensations in places closest to the building's most tragic events. On their own, they are curious stories. Together, though, they paint a haunting picture. Another story-filled hotel in Boston is the Omni Parker House. It opened its doors in 1855, which makes it the oldest continuously operating hotel in the country. In the 1920s, most of the original building was torn down and replaced with new 14-story structure. But with all the history comes a lot of baggage. The most frequent story told in the hotel is that of a ghostly older man seen walking the halls late at night. Those who have seen this figure describe him as bearded and dressed in Victorian clothing. Members of the hotel staff claim it's the spirit of Harvey Parker, the man who built the original hotel nearly 2 centuries ago. If so, Mr. Parker gets around. That's a strange statement to make, sorry. Not only has he been seen in the halls of the 9th and 10th floors, but on at least one occasion a guest has witnessed him outside one of the rooms. One woman who stayed in room 1012 awoke in the night to find the man standing at the foot of her bed. She locked eyes with the ghostly figure for a moment before he spoke. "Are you comfortable?" he reportedly asked. We can probably guess that what her answer was. Many stories, though, are focused on the third floor. Guests there have reported hearing sounds late at night, and they identify as a rocking chair, slowly creaking back and forth. Other guests report that the elevator has an eerie tendency to stop on the third floor, with no one inside. The spirit they blame for that is Charlotte Cushman. Cushman was born right there in Boston and quickly rose to become one of the most famous American actresses of the mid-1800s. She toured most of the English-speaking world with theater productions selling out everywhere she went. But in 1876, she was at the end of her battle with breast cancer and died of pneumonia at the Parker Hotel that February. Her ghost, some say, never checked out. In the 1940s, a traveling liquor salesman apparently killed himself in room 303, and that tragic event has left an indelible mark on the hotel. Guests in the past have complained about the constant smell of whiskey, while others claim they witnessed odd shadows in the room. Shadows, they say, that moved. Other reports claim that the bathtub faucet would turn on all by itself. Guests have heard noises and felt cold spots, all of which create an environment that's a bit too unsettling for their tastes. Since then, the hotel has permanently closed the room, converting it into a storage space. The hauntings have reportedly stopped. Clearly, these spaces have played host to the highs and lows of human life. Somewhere between the wealthy and celebrated and the tragic and painful, something has taken a hold of them. Whether it's ghosts or just the echo of a dramatic story, that's ultimately up to the people who experience the effects. But the story that just might be Boston's darkest is actually set 7 miles to the east, in the middle of a busy harbor. It's easy to overlook it now, but 150 years ago, one island played host to an emotional tale filled with loss and misfortune. And some say that story has never really ended. George's Island isn't large by any stretch of the imagination, but it was big enough for early settlers to use for farming. In 1825, though, the government purchased it for another purpose: coastal defense. This little island seemed like the perfect place to build a fort, which they did, but by the time they finished it in 1847, it was already outdated. They called it Fort Warren, after a local American Revolutionary War hero, and it remained in use for another century before closing its doors just after World War II. Now, admittedly, there aren't any records that support the tale that I'm about to tell you, and I know that makes for a wobbly history. But the reality is that sometimes the only evidence of something historical is the folklore that it leaves behind. It's like a shadow, in a way. It hints that something bigger and more real is there, even if we can't see it. And in this case, it's a story that's worth repeating. During the American Civil War, both sides of the conflict found themselves with a unique problem that none of them could have prepared for. Through the course of the battle, prisoners were taken, and prisoners of war needed to be kept somewhere else. Sometimes, as was the case in Richmond, Virginia, an out-of-the-way place was taken over and converted into a prison camp. Other times, old forts were used, and that's what happened in Boston. In October of 1861, about 750 Confederate prisoners arrived on the island. Some were political figures, like Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. Most, though, were just soldiers, captured in battle. Thankfully, when compared to how prisoners were treated in places like Andersonville in Georgia or Belle Isle in Richmond, the Fort Warren prisoners were treated humanely and with dignity, but they were prisoners nonetheless. One of those prisoners, according to the legend, was a man named Andrew Lanier. Shortly after his arrival, Lanier was said to have written a letter to his wife, Melanie, telling her what had happened and where he was. But when she received the letter, Andrew's wife didn't do what most of us would have done. Melanie didn't resign herself to waiting. She didn't weep and accept defeat. She took action. I know of this story. I've heard of this one before. When she got her husband's letter, Melanie saddled her horse and made the journey north to Massachusetts, eventually arriving in the town of Hull in late December 1861. Now, Hull is important because it's on the coast, and just about a mile across the water to the north is a fort. Fort Warren, in fact. The story goes Melanie hacked off her long hair with a knife, dressed up in man's clothing, and then tucked a pistol and hand axe into her belt. I can't think of anything more hardcore, honestly. This was a woman on a mission. She climbed into a rowboat one night in January 1862 and made her way alone across the channel. When she arrived on the shore of George's Island, where Fort Warren sat waiting, Melanie hid the boat and threaded her way through the dark towards the prison. And then she whistled a song in hopes that her husband would hear it and recognize her. He did, and he whistled back. Once she found the window where Andrew was standing, she managed to slip through. A grown man could never have done it, but she was smaller and braver, and honestly, she traveled hundreds of miles from her safe home in the South just to willingly slip inside a northern prison, all for love. What happens next is a bit of an action movie montage. It's that scene in the A-Team where they build the tank out of a bulldozer, some sheet metal, and leaf blowers equipped with artillery shells. The Laniers rallied the other prisoners, and together they began digging a tunnel. Their goal was to dig their way to the interior of the prison, overpower the handful of guards who were on duty, and then arm themselves for battle. It was a solid plan, and they labored at the tunnel for weeks. All the while, the men worked together to hide Melanie from the guards. They each gave her a portion of their food, and they kept her safe. And they dug, each and every night, armed with that little hand axe they dug, until the night they made a mistake. One of the guards heard the digging. The alarm was instantly raised and the tunnel was discovered, and each of the prisoners was pulled out. When the last man was yanked free, Melanie jumped out of the darkness and drew her pistol, pointing it at one of the officers. Before she could pull the trigger, though, the man slapped the handgun aside and fired it, and it fired as it struck the stone floor. There was silence for a moment. No one spoke. Not the guards, not the prisoners. It was as if the shot had silenced them all. And for a moment, there was no sound except for the slowly dimming ring of the gunshot. And then, Andrew Lanier toppled over, a red, bloody wound in his gut. The pistol had found a target after all. Melanie would follow her husband soon enough, it turns out. For her crime, she was sentenced to death, but before they executed her, she asked for more appropriate clothing. Something more feminine, something befitting a lady. All they could find, though, was a large black robe. Melanie Lanier was hanged in that black robe. After all she'd been through, after all she'd done, she was finally reunited with her husband. Death, as so often is the case, turned out to be the great connector, bringing the lost and separated back together in the end. Of course, it could all be fantasy. The tale of Melanie Lanier is one that defies historical research, only appearing for the first time in a 1944 book about the fort. There's no record of a woman ever being hanged in the prison, no record of a tunnel, nothing that can definitively prove the legend's accuracy. But stories have a way of pointing towards the truth. And while the truth might or might not be the tale of one woman's love for her husband and how she gave everything to set him free, it might be something else. Maybe the story, like so much of folklore, was born out of a need to explain things. You see, ever since the 1860s, the people on the island have frequently reported odd sightings, shapes that seem to slip past the corner of their eye. Police have seen things there, as have tourists and historians and even researchers from MIT. Dark shapes outside the fort, moving against the walls, as if something were trying to find a way inside. Shapes, according to the reports, that resembled a figure dressed in a long black robe. Admittedly, there are a lot of cities around the United States with histories full of tragedy and suffering, but few have seen so much across such a broad space of time. Boston is unique in its dark, unfortunate beauty. Every city has a ghost story, though, or a collection of them. They're as common as the people who tell them, people who believe deep down that something darker is going on beneath the surface of the place they live. I'm literally on the last page, but I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining. Have a great day, or have a great night, Jones. Think of it this way. Our houses are really nothing more than walls and floors enclosing a space. But that's not what makes a house a home. It's the people inside, the personal touches, the familiar objects. They transform a building into a home. That's what folklore does. It finds a way inside. It dresses up a sterile place and gives it life. True or not, it's essential. I have to wonder, without folklore, can any place ever really feel like home? One of the things I find fascinating is just how many important figures call the Omni Parker house home. If only for a little while. The hotel has experienced a nearly endless parade of history right through its hallways. Ho Chi Minh worked there for a year in 1912, and before that, Malcolm X stopped calling himself Malcolm Little, he worked as a busboy there in the 1940s. The hotel has had countless famous guests, and some that were more infamous. John Wilkes Booth stayed there just 8 days before he killed Abraham Lincoln. He came to Boston to visit his brother, also an actor, but while he was at the Parker Hotel, he slipped over into a nearby firing range and practiced using his pistol. The most famous guest at the Parker House, though, might just be Charles Dickens. He'd been to Boston before, way back in 1842, but he was a struggling author back then, and so when he arrived in 1867, things were very different. He was a literary superstar. He lived at the Parker for over 5 months, beginning in the fall of 1867. While there, he performed his novella, A Christmas Carol, for sellout crowds. And all that performance meant he needed to practice. According to the hotel, Dickens would stand in front of his mirror for hours on end, working through his performance and trying to get it just right. 2 years later, Dickens died back at home in England, but some say that Boston, and specifically the Parker, always had a special place in his heart. Perhaps he left a bit of himself there, because that would explain another of the hotel's odd stories. The mirror Dickens rehearsed in front of has long since been moved to another location in the hotel, out in a public area. And because of that, it requires regular cleaning. A few years ago, one of the hotel workmen was walking through the hall when he noticed that the mirror had condensation on it, the sort you might expect if someone had leaned in and breathed really heavily on the glass. So he stopped, pulled a cloth out of his pocket, and proceeded to clean the mirror. When he was done, he turned around and looked to see if anyone was nearby, someone who might have done it, but the hall was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the fog had returned. He cleaned it a second time, and then watched in horror as it reappeared once more, just a few inches from the first spot. It was as if someone were there, standing at the mirror with him, breathing on the glass. But there was no one else there. As you might imagine, the man refused to ever clean the mirror again. Okay, that's where we're gonna call it a night. I went 5 minutes over, and that's okay. I'm just here to read to you guys. But if you guys want me to pick that up again and us keep working through it, I don't mind. We are 58 pages into a 330 page book. I do not mind going through and reading this one for you, and then we can go and start the next one in the trilogy. However, I need some tea. I didn't plan on reading, so my throat hurts just a little bit, and it is about time for me to start getting ready for bed anyway, because I do have to start the work week tomorrow. Thank you for stopping by, supporting me, listening to me talk to you for about an hour and a half, just reading out of a silly book. And thank you for dealing with me losing my mind in League of Legends, because if you know, you know. Work on MLK. Yeah, we're open. Thank you. I appreciate it. I did kind of miss doing reading streams with you guys. I should have probably planned a little bit ahead to know what I was gonna read, but no? Exclamation point? Oh, night-night. I get it. Time to visit. Night-night. Exactly. Good night. I love you guys, and I will see you in the server or next weekend. I will see you guys later.